Welcome to Risk Awareness Week 2019. This presentation is the state of the art in quantitative risk assessment. And this is the first session of 3. In this session, we're going to be talking about the philosophy and setting the framework for how we talk about quantitative risk assessment. My name is Mark Powell. I have had a long career in science, engineering, systems engineering, project management. Risk management has been a big part of that career. It's spanned almost 45 years now, and we've had some great success using risk management properly. And I want to share with you today some concepts specifically so we can really talk about the state of the art in quantitative risk assessment. As I mentioned, this presentation is actually presented in 3 sessions. It's a long piece of material. It is from a full-day tutorial that I've done numerous times at the International Council of Systems Engineering International Symposium. And so I have compacted it into about 3 hours. This is about the first hour of the total tutorial. This first session is we're going to talk about some philosophy and the framework to discuss quantitative risk assessment. The second session, we're going to talk about the thinking, the math, and the code that you need to really perform a state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment. There's some amazing things we can do with quantitative risk assessments today that we couldn't do 20 years ago. So want to at least present this such that people can see what can be done. Once you see what can be done, you can go learn about it and actually do it yourself. And I've taught probably thousands of people how to do this between my college courses and various tutorials and seminars. So I'm presenting this to you as well, such to open your eyes to what can be done in risk assessment. In session 3, we're actually going to get down to how to actually perform state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessments with some real-world examples. Now, these real-world examples are taken mostly from NASA, space, and aerospace, where they're technical. And basically, all of these technical problems are very, very complex. But they're no less or no more complex than the types of problems that you would run into in the financial sector or in any project. But they do illustrate how we can actually get to a good quantitative risk assessment and make some very, very good decisions. So let's get started. We want to talk about the philosophical underpinnings of risk and risk assessment. Now, you know, risk and risk assessment is something that we do as human beings every day, thousands of times. And you would think because we do it so frequently, we would all be real experts at risk and risk assessment. However, there have been some theories put forth that human beings are not really genetically wired to do it properly. And it probably has to do with survival and evolution and the fact that people who are more risk averse may survive to contribute to the gene pool. So we want to go through some philosophical underpinnings to try and abstract things to a point such that everybody can understand where we're going and what we're doing. There are a lot of different standards, a lot of different definitions. I'm going to try to stay away from any of those and just get down to the absolute abstractions and basics such that everybody from every different business sector can at least communicate and understand where we're going. So that's the purpose of this initial start. So first, let's talk about the concept of risk. Now, I'm not going to define risk for you. There's plenty of definitions out there. I know there's at least 50 different risk standards out there. I know because I've reviewed at least 50. There's probably more now. And all of them have a slight variation. It's as if they have the not invented here complex and need to have a unique definition for their particular standard. But I'm going to try to talk to us in terms of what risk actually is, as opposed to a definition. Now, what I want to talk about here is something that you could use as a definition because it's a high-level abstraction. But the point is I want to get to something that everybody can identify with. And quite simply, it's an uncertain future outcome. There's something that's in it. The word future in this particular case is redundant because outcomes always occur in the future. They don't occur in the past. They don't occur in the present. They occur in the future. But the future aspect is extremely important because that's what we're trying to do. With every decision that we make, we're trying to achieve a particular objective in the future, or at least in the present to the future. So it's important that we put it out there. And if you identify some outcome that is uncertain, and they always will be because the future is always uncertain, that's what we call risk. And that's the simplest, most abstract definition I can give you. And we're going to use that throughout these 3 sessions because it's really critical. Rather than use some terminology or some formal definition, this actually covers every single definition that's out there one way or another. So that's the purpose of abstracting it to this particular level. Here's a really, really important point about the concept of risk. The whole suite of realizable outcomes for any risk that you might come up with is always going to range from some worst case outcome to some preferred or best case outcome. And it could be a very, very undesired outcome to a very desired outcome. Quite often we see in risk management, we see people trying to separate risk into risk and opportunity. Risk has the negative connotation and opportunity has the positive connotation, desired outcomes for opportunity, and undesired outcomes for risk. However, even PMI has identified that risk actually spans the range of realizable outcomes always spans something undesired to a more desired outcome. And that's a real important concept that I want to bring out because I think PMI has at least done it right in that particular instance. There are other definitions, there's other things, but the fact of the matter is, even if you buy a lottery ticket, the worst possible case is you lose your dollar that you put in on the lottery. The best possible case could range from, say, just winning a small prize all the way up to the grand prize. So there's a full range of outcomes. Of course, maybe the worst outcome could be that you win the big prize and then all your relatives bug you for the rest of your life for money. I don't know. But regardless, the point is there is a full suite of outcomes that may be realized from some worst case to a best case. And of course, our objective in managing that risk is to try and push it such that whatever outcome is realized will be closer to that best case. So that's our concept of risk. The 2 important things is that it's really nothing more than an uncertain future outcome. Future, as I say in this case, is perhaps redundant because all outcomes are in the future, and the future is always uncertain, and that our outcomes always range from some undesired worst case to a desired best case. Now, there's an aphorism, I forget who originally said it, but that is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I can think of a few people who've been attributed for that aphorism, but regardless, it's been around a long time. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And of course, the whole point of Risk Awareness Week is to manage risk. And we do that, as I mentioned, every single day of our lives, thousands of times every single day. So let's talk about the measure of risk. This is really important. Basically, what it boils down to is how sure we can be, based on all the data and information that's available to us. We want to take advantage of everything we can possibly know, that the outcome that may be realized will either be at or better than some desired outcome, let's call it X, or perhaps we're looking at it from a different perspective, at or worse than some undesired outcome, less than or equal to some Y. So that's the measure of risk. And always, it is before some time T in the future. Usually, when we're working on a project, we're talking about the end of the project, or maybe over some particular interval. For example, with the space shuttle, it turns out that about 25% of the total risk to the mission was comprised in the launch part of the mission. Now, the launch part of the mission ended when the solid rocket boosters were jettisoned and the external tank was jettisoned and the space shuttle entered orbit. So that part of the risk at that point was over. It became overcome by events. And of course, what happens when an outcome is no longer an issue, that probability goes to zero. Now, the kicker here is that we have to be careful, because unless the outcomes are countably discrete, and I will give as an example, say the roll of a die, maybe even a 20-sided die as the kids use in Dungeons and Dragons, the outcomes are discrete and they're countable, easily countable. Unless the count is also small in number, like I say, 20, we basically have to go to considering those outcomes to be a continuous space of outcomes. And in that case, because we're using a continuous model for our outcome space, we have to use inequalities, not specific outcome values. Occasionally we run into situations where the outcomes are countably discrete, but for the vast majority of cases that we run into in real life, they're not countably discrete. They basically range continuously. Even when you talk about money, if your unit is dollars, it may range from negative $10,000 to millions of dollars. And we use, instead of millions and millions of individual discrete values, we use a continuous model for the dollars. So that's important to consider, because it's really what we actually apply. Now, this presentation, these three presentations are all going to be about application and what we actually do. I'm not really talking so much about theory, we're talking about philosophy and concepts here, but the point is that we are looking at how we actually apply it and use it in the real world. So we do use continuous measures. Now, the complete measure of risk, well, when you have completely measured risk, you actually can compute a complete set of probabilities. Now, they're all based on all the data and information that are available to you in the present. Bear in mind, all your data and information happen in the past or the present. They are not in the future. You may get new data in the future, but at that point that you get the new data, it becomes the present. But right now, it's based on all the available data and information that you have. And the point is for every possible realizable future outcome, or worse, or better, depending on how you're looking at it, you will have a complete set of probabilities for every single one. And also at every point in the future till the end of the project or to whatever your set time point of interest is. So you'll be able to compute those probabilities regardless of when it is in the future. Generally, we stop computing those probabilities at the end of the project. Clearly, they become OBE at that point because the project is a success, which is the whole point of risk management. And if I were going to put that in an equation, it would be the probability that the outcome at some time t greater than now is greater than or equal to some outcome x given our data and information. Or if you're looking at it from a different perspective, the probability that an outcome at some time in the future is less than or equal to some undesired outcome y given the data and the information. For every value of t and x, in other words, every value of time in the future and every value of possible realizable outcome, either x and or y. You can do it for both, actually, if you have a complete measure of your risk. Now, I just introduced some notation for, since I put equations on there, I want to give you some notation, the notation I'm going to use for these sessions. So let's go through that very, very quickly. It's pretty simple. It's pretty standard, just to make sure nobody confuses it, because I've seen it in the literature in a variety of ways. And it can be quite confusing. But for these sessions, whenever you see a capital P with something in parentheses, like P of x greater than 3, that means probability that x is greater than 3. If I use a lowercase PD of something in parentheses, y in this case, What I'm really talking about is a probability density model for the variable y. Now, in this particular case, you saw this in the previous equation that I gave you. Probability of x greater than 3, given that y is less than 2. We use that vertical bar to mean given. Now, this is, of course, a conditional probability, and all probability, in fact, is conditional. There is a such thing as just straight probability. It's always conditional one way or another. And I'll introduce you to that concept in a little more detail in the second session. But the point is that when you see that vertical bar, it means given. It's a conditional probability. And likewise, we can have conditional probability density models. If you see little pd of x bar y, it means probability density model for the variable x given y. And it's really important for us to use the Boolean AND operator. And that is the probability that x is greater than 3 and y is less than 2. We use the comma there to indicate the Boolean AND operator. It's a shorthand, but it's a very, very common shorthand that we use. And likewise, we can have joint probability density models with the variable x and y simultaneously. And one final notation for you, I use the tilde for the Boolean NOT operator. If you see probability of tilde x greater than 3, that means the probability that x greater than 3 is not true. Or you could convert that to probability that x is less than or equal to 3. That's equivalent to that. So that's the notation. It's fairly straightforward. The bar is really important for you to recognize. The comma for the AND. We won't use the tilde that much, but we will use it occasionally for the Boolean NOT operator. And of course, the lowercase pd for probability density model, because as you noticed earlier, I did talk about using coming up with uncertainty models, which are probability density models. Now, some notes on our risk measure. Every outcome, or better or worse, at each point in time is going to have a unique uncertainty model, a unique probability density model. A lot of people don't realize this, but it actually is unique. Now, the implications, if you were to write it down, the probability density model for an outcome at some time ti, which is greater than now, that's greater than, say, an outcome x1, given our data, that's the way we would express that model. The implications are as follows. For example, the probability at the same time for 2 different outcome levels or greater is different. It's definitely going to be different because the model will be different for each one of those. Likewise, at the same outcome level or worse, at different times, those probabilities will not be equal as well. So they literally, the probabilities change as a function of time, which is really important. They also change as a function of the possible outcome, or better or worse, that you're running into. Now, typically, as I mentioned before, we only worry about risk up to the time at the end of the project that we've closed it down, and I call that TEOP, sub-EOP. Now, some risk, however, I mentioned the space shuttle and its launch phase. Some risks do become overcome by events before TEOP. The probability, what that means is the probability goes to 0 for that particular risk at that point. Those are nice. We always like to see those. Every project has those. For example, you may have a risk that a supplier is going to be available. But when they actually start providing product to you, that risk goes away. Now, the question that you might ask, since we do this daily, we do it thousands of times daily, do we really need all of that? Well, the point here is I want to show you what the concepts behind what we do every single day, thousands of times, actually are at an abstract level. Of course, the time dependence is really important to recognize. The time dependence is critical. As I mentioned to you, at different times, at the same outcome level, you're going to have different probabilities because the models are unique at every point in time and for every outcome or worse or outcome or better level that you set. A small impact, of course, being realized earlier is always easier and cheaper to correct than if it occurs later. And this happens regardless of what the probability level is. It's a function of time. Even if the probability of that small impact occurring decreases with time, it may very well be that it's still cheaper and easier to fix, even when it's at a higher probability level of occurring. The probability of a particular outcome level, or above or low, may increase or decrease with time. This is sometimes a surprise to people. And the reason why is that every one of these models changes. And I've got examples in session 3 that we'll see where it actually does. And that's kind of a remarkable result, something that until I actually hit it in my career, I always thought probabilities went up for something happening the longer horizon you were looking at. At that same probability level, it may be that the realizable outcome level, in other words, if your probability level that you're comfortable with, say, is a 5% probability of occurrence, the realizable outcome level may actually go down at that probability level, or it may increase. Generally, we normally are conservative and think in terms of it only going up, but it may go down as well. Also, very importantly, in any good decision, we structure our decisions such that we apply our values after we find out what all the probabilities are. A little dirty secret that most people won't tell you is that every human being has values for probabilities, as well as values for the outcomes that may be realized. And our values change as a function of time. This is a big issue with utility theory. If we have some sessions on utility theory, application of utility theory is great. However, the big flaw in the ointment with utility theory is that decision maker values change with time. So you really have to do your utility elicitation from the decision maker at the instant they're making the decision, or else it won't apply. Now, why do we measure risk? Well, I mentioned earlier the aphorism, we can only manage what we can measure. That's an important aspect. But the main reason why is we're making decisions. We make thousands of decisions every day, whether to carry an umbrella or not, depending on what it looks like and what the weatherman has suggested to us for probability of rain. And I will tell you that every single decision made over the past 4.5 billion years within 250,000 miles of the center of the earth was based on a measure of risk. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to humans. If you have pets that you're very close to, you may observe your pets actually making decisions based on risk. For example, I have bird dogs, and my bird dogs sometimes I can tell the wheels are cranking in their heads. They're thinking about perhaps busting a bird and chasing a bird instead of remaining on point, because there is a risk that I might severely correct them if they do, versus the risk of the bird escaping. And you see that calculation, literally can see that calculation. It happens with animals as well. It is the way life on Earth has evolved, and it's what happens. Every single decision ever made. And of course, the reason why I said 250,000 miles from the center of the Earth is that we've had astronauts circle the moon. Every single decision that we have has objectives. There's something we want to achieve by making that decision. And we measure the risk that the outcomes that might be realized for every alternative we're considering, given that particular alternative, that alternative will not achieve those objectives. Now, how we make our decisions, it's a little more complex than this, but it basically boils down to we choose the alternative that has the least measure of the risk that we won't achieve our decision objectives with that alternative. So that's why we measure risk, so we can make good decisions. And this applies throughout formal risk management as well as that risk management we do thousands of times every single day. Now, since I've mentioned formal risk management, I like to make a very, very careful distinction. This distinction does not get made very often. But one of the things that I do in a lot of my courses is that for the most general concept for a term, I will use lowercase first initials. In this case, little rm risk management is the general concept of risk management that is applied in every single decision we make. Big RM risk management, however, is that formal risk management process that we use on every project. And it is that formal risk management process that is usually the focus of every risk management standard. I will tell you, every single decision that's ever been made is an exercise in little RM risk management. We are typically trying to manage the risk of the alternative we select in our decisions not achieving our objectives. Every single project plan that ever gets written, a project plan should be written before the start of a project. And a project plan is nothing more than making decisions on how you run the project, specifically to mitigate the risk of the project not being successful. Project management plan, system engineering management plan, risk management plan, or reliability management plan. RMP has a lot of acronym usages or abbreviation usages. System integration and verification plan, configuration management plan, etc. There may be 50 management plans that have to be produced before a project actually gets started in earnest. They're all exercises in risk management. The reason why is everybody who writes these plans has to make decisions in advance and has to set up the mitigations for what could possibly happen that would counter or not be the realizable outcome of the project being a success. That's the reason why we write them. They're an exercise in risk management. Those risks, we're all human. None of us, when we write our plans, can identify every single thing that can possibly happen. Now, for most of these, like the ones that I mentioned to you, project management plan, SIMP, risk management plan, configuration management plan, there are actually professional organizations for each of these areas. You have PMI, you have the International Council of System Engineering, there are various risk management societies. There are certifications for practitioners in these areas, and there are standards of practice in those areas as well. And those are all focused on making sure that the project is going to be a success. But we're all human. We know that there's a huge number of things, huge number of uncertain future outcomes for any project that we're going to work on. And we address all those that we can think of before we get started, all those standard ones and the things that are specific to the specific project. And we put them in our project management plans. But those that, because we're human, we can't think of every single thing. And because we're human, we have to have a big RM project organization, big RM risk management project organization to handle those things that we didn't address. Because those things that we didn't address in all of our plans can jump up and bite us and cause the project to not be a success as well. So when you see me use capital R and capital M, big RM risk management, I'm talking about the formal organization. And we will talk about that a little bit, but we're going to be talking, since little RM is used in big RM management, we're going to be focusing most on little RM risk management. But we want to make this distinction because it's really important. One of the things that we see a lot in projects, which is kind of a shame, but we see folks that actually don't do the primary first management job and get all these plans written before projects start, and they dump all those standard risks into the risk management organization. That's an almost surefire recipe for project disaster. And I mean, there's many cases where I'm sure probably all of you've seen that, where it gets dumped in and a project gets started with thousands and thousands of risk in the formal big RM risk management organization that they're dealing with, that are all standard risks that everybody has known for centuries, if not thousands of years. And for every risk that is identified after project start that's not addressed in one of the project plans, big RM risk management's got to facilitate a decision. Now, I will mention here that one of the very first things that big RM risk management, that organization, has to do whenever somebody on your project, let's say you do have a good risk culture. Basically, what a good risk culture boils down to is you don't have a shoot the messenger structure and a shoot the messenger process in effect for anybody who identifies a risk. We've all seen projects like that, where managers are scared to death if anybody brings up something that might save their bacon in the long run. But if you have a good risk management culture, everybody working on the project is going to think of things that they think has not been addressed. A big part of big RM management's job is to go and look and verify that that is something actually new and unique and not already covered. So a lot of these risks that are identified are closed out. We certainly, in a good risk culture project, don't want to discourage anybody from even bringing up things that are already taken care of in a variety of any of the project management plans. But they've got to facilitate a decision when a real one has popped up that is not addressed. And I use some colors here intentionally. They either accept the risk, and what that boils down to is you commit the contingency as if the outcome has occurred. And then you let whatever outcome is going to be realized or not occur. So that's what we mean when we accept the risk. We commit the contingency. It is already, we write it off of our budget. And if it turns out that it never occurs by the end of the project, we come in under budget. That contingency is available to us. Another alternative is that we monitor and we reassess the risk as new data becomes available, which it will in the future. And when new data becomes available, we have to go through a new risk assessment process and determine we have to measure the risk again. And as that data becomes available, of course, we're faced with a new decision. Do we accept if the risk has gotten low enough, below some acceptable level, or do we continue to monitor and wait for new data to come in, or do we exercise the third alternative, which is to mitigate? You'll notice I use green, yellow, and red, which are the standard risk colors that we look at. And I did that intentionally because we typically have three alternatives for big RM risk management to address. And notice I said that they facilitate a decision. They are not necessarily the decision maker as to what's going to occur. Project management team is the ultimate decision maker on what actually occurs. So when you mitigate a risk, actually you create a new project, and that project is to take actions to increase the probability that a more desired outcome or a less undesired outcome is going to be realized on the project. And of course that can be that an outcome is never realized. It becomes OBE by the end of the project. So big RM always has to facilitate a decision. It all comes back to decisions, whether we're looking at big RM risk management or the more general little RM risk management. So I wanted to make that distinction. We don't see it very often, but it's really, really important. And as I say, I think a really, really important thing is for project management to step up and fulfill that very first responsibility to get all of their plans written. And there may be, I've been on projects where as a chief system engineer, primarily responsible for the system energy management plan and all the plans below that except for the controls plan. I've had 43, 48 plans on different projects that had to be developed before the project starts. When you do that and you execute the quarterly plan, you've got a recipe for success. It's the first recipe for success. But it's important that if that's not done, big RM risk management has an almost unmanageable job. Let's talk about big RM management processes. I want to go through these very briefly and show where they fit. Obviously, we have to write a risk management plan. We have to establish the procedures for how we're going to actually address those. Whenever someone identifies on a project, you have a good risk culture, identifies some uncertain future outcome that say is not in one of those plans. You have to have a procedure for identifying that as well. Obviously, your plans should be in your project database and should be easily searchable. They have to determine whether it's something new, but you have to have a procedure for how you're going to address it, what the schedule is, how long they're going to be in. Actually, we did a presentation, the International Council of System Engineering Risk Management Working Group, of which I was the chair for a number of years. In 2005, we did a paper on risk management, big RM risk management metrics, how to measure the actual risk management. I've got a copy of that presentation published or posted on my website, and actually the actual paper which was one of the best paper awards that particular year at the NCOSE International Symposium. It's posted on the NCOSE website. So anyway, there are metrics for actually measuring how well project management is executed and the procedures. Risk identification. This is that culture where everybody in the project will discover those things that we missed when we did our planning. It's really important. If you don't identify them, you can't do anything about them. I mean, an unknown unknown can bite you, and you can't do anything about it. Can't even budget for it. Risk analysis. Now, this is more akin to engineering. This is where we actually analyze the causal factors and the sensitivities for the realizable outcomes. And we have to look at it from a focus on both time and those realizable outcome levels that we want to look at. This is an engineering process, and this is where we establish our causal models for both the sensitivities and the actual root causes. If you don't understand the root cause, you can't do anything about it. Risk assessment. This is where we statistically process the available data and information to actually calculate that complete suite of probabilities we need to affect those decisions that we talked about in that I mentioned in the last slide in big RM risk management. Risk mitigation, as I mentioned, this is a project, a separate project to try and increase the probability that a more desired or a less undesired outcome will be realized, or that the outcome will be OBE, which is even better. That means that we save a lot of budget. Risk tracking and control. We do have to monitor and measure our performance of risk management, just like everything else is measured on a project. Controls, the management of controls, project schedule and budget has to be tracked and controlled as well. We have to monitor and measure the performance of big RM risk management on the project. And risk communication. This is one that I really like because I like to point out that when you perform big R risk management, we have to be good communicators as well. And there is one message that we want to be communicating continuously. And that message is how what we're doing is assuring project success. Now, of course, the focus in big RM risk management in this presentation and the three that we're doing for the state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment is risk assessment. It's where we're statistically processing our data and information that we have to calculate that full suite of probabilities at all possible times in the future that are relevant at all possible realizable outcome levels and above or below. Now, risk assessments, that's our focus. What is a risk assessment? Well, to abstract again to a simple level, what we really do is almost a numerical methods process. We transform the available data and information into uncertainty models for all possible outcomes or worse or better being realized at each point in the future of the project or by each point in the future of the project. That's literally what we're doing when we do risk assessment. And that gives us the capability with those uncertainty models to integrate those models. They're almost always continuous. Occasionally you will get discrete outcomes where you actually have probabilities for each outcomes instead of a continuous model. And if you remember from your calculus, if you integrate anything from A to A, the answer is 0, which is the exact problem that we run into. The probability, if our outcome range is continuous, the probability of any specific outcome, not an outcome or better, an outcome or worse, is going to be 0, identically. Once we have those probabilities, we can make optimal decisions. The reason why is we have all the probabilities at all times in the future for all outcome levels and worse, or outcome levels or better. And in that case, we can find the optimum decision. That's what risk assessment is. Now let's talk about qualitative versus quantitative risk assessments. I need to give you some background on me. My background is in the hard sciences, physics specifically. And when we talk about quantitative analysis and a quantitative assessment in physics, it's not that we're merely using numbers. I can't tell you how many people that I have run into that think just because you put numbers across the bottom and across the vertical axis of a risk matrix, you now have quantitative risk assessment, or you're doing things quantitatively. Just because you use numbers doesn't mean it's a quantitative analysis, not from a physics perspective. And when I say physics here, you know, most of you are probably thinking, oh, like Newton and Galileo and all of the famous physicists, Feynman, all these guys. Well, there is physics even in the financial world. There are causal models, things that cause various things to happen. So I will use physics in a general sense to really what the cause and effects actually are for the things that can happen, specifically for those outcomes that can occur in the future. But we occasionally see quantitative bandied about as being so much better than qualitative, while a lot of times what's being bandied about as quantitative is actually qualitative. So let's talk about that. I want to get down to the actual root of what real quantitative risk assessments are. And really the distinction is quite simple. Qualitative risk assessment employs guesses. Now there's an exception, I'll talk about that in a minute. And also we think about qualitative risk assessment, we quite often fold in personal values, and every single decision is based on personal values. Don't think that they're not. A lot of engineers try to convince themselves or deceive themselves into believing that they make decisions based solely on technical merit. Nothing is further from the truth. Likewise with every decision. But it's qualitative if a guess is used. Okay, now there's an exception I'll talk about in a minute, and it's an advancement in the state of the art as well. Synonyms for guesses. Now you could come up with a bunch. Here's just a brief look. Assumptions. If you make an assumption, you've guessed. If you use heuristics, you've guessed. Expert opinions are guesses. Conjectures, hunches, presumptions, suppositions, speculation, wild-ass guess, sophisticated wild-ass guess, beliefs, etc. Those are all synonyms for guesses. If any of those are employed, you're really in qualitative space. It may be a more and a better refined qualitative space, but it's still got guesses in it. Now, I get into arguments with a lot of people, quite often on LinkedIn, that you can't avoid assumptions. You can't avoid guesses. Well, you can, and there are ways to do this. And I will tell you that the exception here with using guesses in a quantitative risk assessment is where you use that guess, actually use information theoretic methods to extract the information. Guesses always have a lot of information. They're not just they're not a random number generator produced thing. So they are actually contain a lot of information. And if we use proper methods to extract that information out of the noise that is in a guess, out of the assumptions, out of the values that are applied, we can actually use that in a quantitative risk assessment. I've got some references on how to do this. Fascinating thing is when you actually use these techniques, these information theoretic techniques. I've been in situations where I've been offered expert opinions that vary widely amongst the experts on a particular project, on a particular topic. And the experts are really highfalutin and harumphing about how their opinion is most important. When you actually employ those properly, extract the proper information, and produce the good quantitative risk assessments that we can do, a state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessments, every one of those experts are comfortable with the results. I've fully expected when I've done this, I've fully expected going in, says, well, Joe Blow over here, who said so-and-so was the way it had to go, is going to really complain about this. But they all get extremely comfortable with it. So that's an amazing result I did not expect. I've done this a number of times, and it works beautifully. And we have a state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment when we extract. We don't want to neglect expert opinions. We don't want to neglect assumptions, heuristics, but we have to properly model them, and we have to properly employ them in a real quantitative risk assessment. When we do that, it's quantitative, not qualitative. Well, the question then comes up, Are qualitative risk assessments bad? Of course not. 99.9, and I got a whole lot more nines. I would have put more nines along that line if the boundary of PowerPoint allowed me to. Percent of every decision ever made is based on a qualitative risk assessment. Now, the human race has not died out as a result of all these qualitative risk assessments. Projects have not all failed. We've had numerous phenomenal projects that have been based on qualitative risk assessments. Now, have they been the most optimal decisions? No. And when I say optimal, usually you're spending more money. You're expending more resources than you really need to in a decision. That doesn't mean that the project or the decision is horrible. It just means that you don't have an optimal decision. The suboptimal decision is usually more than good enough for whatever we need to do. And the consequences of the worst case realizable outcome aren't so horrible that you need to do something different. The consequences of the best case realizable outcome aren't so fabulous that we want to do something different. So we use qualitative risk assessments all the time. Are they bad? Of course not. We do more stuff with them at all. So you might be wondering, why this business of quantitative risk assessments? Why do these state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessments that I'm talking about? Well, one reason is we can. And the real reasons why are sometimes those consequences are too extreme. And they can be an extreme both sides. They can be too bad, loss of life, for example. Safety is nothing more than a big exercise in little RM risk management. Usually we have cases of loss of life, somebody injury, something that's just unacceptable to us. Sometimes it's a case of too much money. There's too much money involved, too much loss that might occur, or too much gain that might occur. At that point, we want to do something a little bit different. Real state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessments enable us to make optimal decisions because we have the probabilities at every point in time, at every realizable outcome level or worse, realizable outcome level or better, we can find the optimum, and that will always save us resources. Sometimes the resources involved in those decisions are what's involved, not necessarily the outcome itself. State-of-the-art quantitative risk assessments can actually cost much less than a qualitative risk assessment. Now, that probably sounds astounding to a lot of people, but how many of you have been involved in one of these massive groups of senior folks on a project where you may have 20 to 50 people in a room for 8 hours trying to pin a number, come to concurrences and pin risk on a risk matrix? And not only that, but usually those big groups are facilitated by some expensive risk consultant who is going to spend 8 hours. He's probably going to charge you for 16, 24 plus travel to come there and do the facilitation of that. When a quantitative risk assessment might be performed, state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment might be performed, that everybody in the room would be comfortable with in perhaps a couple hours worth of work by one person who can perform that quantitative risk assessment. That's a dirty little secret. So we asked the question, why state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessments? I mentioned earlier, because we can do them today. And actually, they could be a whole lot cheaper. And as I mentioned, there are a number of risk consultants out there. And if you're online and you're one of them, you know who you are, who make a living off of facilitating these big group meetings. Is that a good expenditure of money for a whole bunch of guesses for qualitative risk assessment? That's really up to the person who's footing the bill. I rarely see that being an effective use, especially when we can do state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessments. There's a dirty little secret that they can cost a lot less. And then the question comes up, why not always use quantitative risk assessments? Well, most people come up with the excuse that they're hard to do. And of course, they do require that you employ a lot of thinking, not thinking about the guesses that you're going to employ or the assumptions that you're going to use,
you really have to do a good, proper causal analysis and identify the sensitivities. Of course, you need to do that for every risk anyway. But if you're just going to employ guesses anyway, sometimes you could just skip that. They do require some math. Now, the math is not that hard. It's nothing beyond about second-year calculus. Every MBA should have second-year calculus. Any engineer should have more than second-year calculus. Anybody in the sciences should have, hard sciences anyway, should have more than second-year calculus. And of course, they do require some programming. Of course, most people today get programming in elementary school. So you're exposed to it. There's so many programming languages and tools available. You're going to have to do a little bit of that. But everybody today should have, anybody in an important role, should have had some experience doing that. And I've actually presented these techniques to rooms full of C-level executives who actually executed for some PMI, Project Management Institute, presentations and seminars and workshops that I've done. I've had executives who are making decisions regularly on the order of $100 million to billions of dollars sit down and actually be able to do these. So anybody who's qualified to be in those positions can do a quantitative risk assessment. But most people think they're hard to do. Most people don't want to burn those calories above the neck. But that's what they pay us to do. The mathematical formulations also. The mathematical formulations for most real-world problems, I will show you a counterexample to this in session 3, using all the data and information that's available to us, without using any guesses or assumptions, almost always become analytically intractable. In other words, we can't solve it. We can't come up with the probabilities that we need. The uncertainty models are not integrable. So people give up when they see that. And that's been a valid response. Turns out that for most real-world problems, ordinary numerical methods to address this analytical intractability rarely provide us solutions. And it turns out up until about the mid-1990s, they were indeed impossible to solve. And when I say impossible to solve, you could not actually get those probabilities that you needed for every point in time in the future and every outcome level or above or lower. So nobody bothered teaching how to do it. Well, in the mid-1990s, it became possible to actually do these and come up with solutions for these intractable problems. This pretty much concludes the concepts that I wanted to discuss with you and get across. I've tried to abstract them to a high level. If you go into the next sessions with those concepts, and I think if you go into your job thinking about those concepts, that'll really help your ability to do your jobs. In session 2, we're going to talk a little more about the thinking that's involved in a state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment, the math that's involved. I'm going to show you some ugly math, most of which you don't have to do. But the reason why I'm going to show you the ugly math is to show you that there is a hard mathematical basis behind it. And we'll talk a little bit about the algorithms and the code that you have to write, which is really not that bad. In session 3 coming up, we'll actually go through a stepwise process, how to perform a state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment. And I'm going to give you some real-world examples that go beyond the actual problem that we run into with needing a state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment, but problems actually outside that, and how we can actually address those problems with a state-of-the-art quantitative risk assessment. My contact information, you see my email address, my phone number, website there. There's a ton of resources on that website. Website more than anything else is to help promulgate and help people learn how to do these things that I've learned how to do over a number of decades. I recommend you connect with me on LinkedIn. I get into some really engaging and interesting discussions about these topics. Sometimes they get real heated because some people just don't realize what's possible to do today. So that's my contact information. I welcome contact. If you have any questions about what I've presented, clearly through this medium,
of this presentation, there are ways to introduce questions, but you can contact me directly also if you'd like to. And here's a list of resources that I have used that I really believe in. Big list of resources. I have read each one of those page by page by page. I have them all annotated and have learned a tremendous amount from all of these. I recommend these resources. I want to thank you very much for your time. And as I say, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.